أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين. This is our 8th episode of Introduction to Rijal Studies. We left off in the last episode talking about Kamil al-Ziyarat and Ibn Qawlawayh's introduction to his book Kamil al-Ziyarat. We talked about mass authentications and that one of the purposes of studying ilm al-Rijal, especially the principles to ilm al-Rijal, is to study the mass authentications. So instead of going through one narrator one by one and seeing if he's reliable or he's not reliable, so on and so forth, we can see some mass authentications from certain books. The authors of certain books in their introductions, they authenticated the narrators in their books. And this is called a mass authentication. You'd get 100 narrators they get authenticated automatically, 100 or 200 or 300. What we'd like to do is examine these mass authentications. Are they reliable or are they not reliable? Are they proven or are they not proven? So in the last episode, we talked about Kamil al-Ziyarat and Ibn Qawlawayh's introduction in Kamil al-Ziyarat. And we said that Ibn Qawlawayh stated that I was not able to collect all the narrations regarding Ziyarat in my book. But what I did was I collected the narrations that were narrated by the reliable sources, the reliable transmitters. And I do not rely on weak transmitters, except those that are known to be scholars of hadith and scholars of riwayah, the ulama, I'll rely on them. This section of his introduction became very debatable and controversial. What does he mean by, he says, I've only relied on the reliable transmitters. But then he says, and I will not rely on weak transmitters unless there are scholars of hadith and riwayah. This excerpt became very vague. Anyhow, we said in the last episode that there are 3 opinions regarding Kamil al-Ziyarat. One opinion states that he authenticated all of the narrators, all 388 narrators in his book. And this was the opinion of Sayyid al-Khoi for a while, and then he changed his mind. The second opinion is what Sayyid al-Khoi changed his mind to, and that is he only authenticates Ibn Qawlawayh, his teachers, or approximately 30 or 33 teachers. He authenticates them and he considers them as thuqat, not the others. The third opinion is by Sayyid al-Sistani. He says Ibn Qawlawayh, neither did he authenticate all of his narrators in his book nor his direct teachers. Rather, he's saying something else. Now, let us come and try to dissect this issue and see which opinion is correct. We have to look at their we have to look at their evidence and proof, and then finally come out with a conclusion. So, first of all, Ja'far ibn Muhammad ibn Qawlawayh, there's no doubt about it, no doubt that he's reliable, he's trustworthy, he was one of our greatest scholars, he was the teacher of Shaykh al-Mufid, and in fact, him and Shaykh al-Mufid, Ibn Qawlawayh and the Shaykh al-Mufid are buried next to each other in Al-Qazwini, in the mausoleum, in the shrine of Al-Imamain Al-Qazwini, close to the grave of the 2 Imams. Shaykh al-Mufid and his teacher Ibn Qawlawayh are buried there. So there's no doubt that the man is reliable. So we said the first opinion regarding Kamil Ziyarat is that he's authenticating all of his narrators. It seems that the first person that paid attention to this and believed in this opinion was Al-Hurr Al-Amili in his book Wasa'il Al-Shia. The author of Wasa'il Al-Shia, very well-known book. The house of every jurist, every mujtahid has to have a copy of Wasa'il Al-Shia. It's a 20 or 30 volume book depending on the different publications. And it's a compilation of the narrations of Ahl Bayt. In the last volume of his book, Al-Hurr Al-Amili, he states that Ja'far ibn Muhammad ibn Qawlawayh, in his introduction, he authenticated all of his narrators. He authenticated the narrators of his book Kamil Ziyarat. And as we said, Sayyid al-Khoi believed in this theory. He believed in this opinion that Ibn Qawlawayh authenticated all of his narrators, 388. Yes, unless with mass authentications. How mass authentications work is that those narrators are deemed reliable unless someone comes out and explicitly says that this person is weak. Let me give you an example. Someone might come and say that the family of so-and-so are all reliable, they're all scholars, except one or two individuals, and he names those individuals. Khalas, these two, they've been exempted. They're an exception. It's the same with mass authentications. So if Ibn Qawlawayh, according to Sayyid al-Khoi, Ibn Qawlawayh authenticates all of his narrators, all 388 narrators. But Sayyid al-Khoi says, unless Najashi or Tusi, they come and say that some of them are weak, then those weak narrators we're not going to rely on. The mass authentication is not going to do anything for them because they have been explicitly stated to be unreliable. And so Sayyid al-Khoi believed in this opinion that all the narrators of Kamil Ziyarat are reliable, and also Sayyid Muhammad Sa'id al-Hakim, hafidhahullah, one of the contemporary scholars in Najaf, he also believes that Ibn Qawlawayh authenticated all of his narrators. Now, what is their proof? What is their proof? They say that Ibn Qawlawayh is trying to give value to his book, Kamil Ziyarat. Usually in an introduction of any book, the author tries to, praise his book, give value to his book. And that's exactly what Ibn Qawlawayh tried to do. He's trying to give value to his book. He's trying to encourage his readers to read his book and rely on his book. They could rely on it intellectually, academically. Well, how could that happen? He has to authenticate all of his narrators. Because some people will tell him, well, how can we trust you? How can we trust the individuals that you narrate from? So right in the beginning, he says that I am narrating from reliable, authentic narrators and transmitters. So it only makes sense because he's trying to give value to his book, and giving value to your book will only happen if you say that I relied on reliable sources. My book is based on reliable sources. It's based on reliable transmitters. So this is the first proof and evidence to their book. And to be honest, this is the only proof and evidence for the first opinion. The rest is, it's nothing important. It's only defensive. It's, Sayyid al-Khoi and Sayyid al-Hakim, they tried to defend their theory. But this is their main proof and evidence, that Ibn Qawlawayh is trying to give value to his book, and that only happens if he gives a mass authentication. But the problem with this theory, there's lots of problems. One problem is that it's been proven that 60 individuals at least in Kamil Ziyarat are unreliable. Da'if. They're da'if. 60 individuals. Out of the 388, 60 are weak. So how can Ibn Qawlawayh say that I have relied on reliable transmitters while he knows that 60 of his narrators are weak? This is a problem. Sayyid al-Khoi or Sayyid al-Hakim, they tried to defend this by saying, well, maybe according to him, those 60 were what? They were not weak. Maybe according, in the eyes of others, they were weak, but maybe in his eyes, they were not weak. But one of the major problems in this theory is that none of the former scholars said it. None of the former scholars believed in it. Najashi didn't say it. Tusi didn't say it. None of them said that Ibn Qawlawayh in his introduction is authenticating all of his narrators. The first to say this was Al-Hurr Al-Amili. No one else paid attention to it. And this, it means something. It means that no one understood from the introduction of Ibn Qawlawayh a mass authentication for all of his narrators. And if he really meant to authenticate all of his narrators, at least some of the former scholars would have said so. Tusi, Najashi, others, they would have said so. Not even Al-Allam Al-Hilli, not even the later scholars. Al-Hurr Al-Amili, he's not even considered from the Muta'akhirin, he's considered from the Muta'akhir al-Muta'akhirin, the later scholars. So this is a problem. And that is why Sayyid al-Khoi, towards the end of his life, he retreated. And he took back his statement. And he chose another opinion. And he said that I made a mistake in believing that Ibn Qawlawayh authenticated all of his narrators, all 388 narrators. It seems that he's only authenticating his teachers, only his teachers, which are about 30 or 33. Why? He says, because I went through the book. Of course, we know that some of his students, they pressured him and they convinced him. They were the ones that convinced him to go back on that opinion. He says, when we go back to the book, we see that some of the narrations are, he has relied upon unreliable sources. He's relied upon individuals that are, not only are they unreliable, but they're known for their unreliability. They're known for their dha'f. Like Al-Hasan ibn Ali ibn Abi Uthman, Muhammad ibn Abdullah ibn Mihran, Umayya ibn Ali al-Qaysi. He says these people are known to be weak. And then he says that Ibn Qawlawayh stated at the end of his introduction that I've relied on the scholars of hadith and the scholars of riwayah. But many of his narrators and transmitters, they don't have this quality. They were not scholars of hadith or riwayah. So, presumably, he was talking about his teachers. He wasn't talking about anyone else. So, Sayyid al-Khoi retreated and he backed out of the first opinion and he chose the second opinion. And the second opinion is that the authentication, the tawthiq, is only for his teachers, direct teachers, those who he narrates from directly. And several scholars chose this opinion. For example, Al-Muhaddith Al-Nuri in his book Mustadrak Al-Wasa'il, he chose this opinion. Al-Shaheed Al-Sayyid Muhammad Baqir Al-Sadr, this is his opinion. In Buhuthun fi Sharh Al-Urwat Al-Wuthqa. Al-Shaykh Ghulam Rida Arfaniyan, a contemporary scholar of Rijal, he chose this opinion. Al-Shaykh al-Subhani chose this opinion. Al-Shaykh al-Dawari chose this opinion as well. So a great majority of modern contemporary scholars of Rijal, they chose the second opinion. And I could say, perhaps, that the second opinion is the most popular opinion on the book. And that is that Ibn Qawlawayh is not authenticating all of his narrators, but rather he's only authenticating his teachers. Now, what proof and evidence does this second opinion have? One, they say that Ibn Qawlawayh, in that statement, in which he says, I relied on reliable narrators and I did not rely upon al-shadhad min al-rajal, weak narrators, and that unless, I narrated from the scholars of riwayah and hadith and all of that, and those that are famous for being scholars of hadith, he wasn't trying to give value to his book, no. He was trying to say that I relied on reliable scholars. I relied upon reliable narrators. And if you will find weak narrations, I did not narrate from them directly. I relied upon a reliable narrator, and perhaps that reliable narrator, he narrated from someone weak. You might say, well, at the end of the day, does it make a difference? It does make a difference. It does make a difference, especially in the custom of ilm al-Rijal, especially with the former scholars. Former scholars. Narrating directly from a weak source, this was a major taboo. Someone who's known to be a liar, someone who's known to be weak, you come and narrate a story or a hadith from him, this is a taboo. People tell you, what are you doing? Are you crazy? Why are you relying on an unreliable source? And we saw how in Qawm, those that were reliable themselves, but they relied on someone who's unreliable, da'if, they would kick them out of Qawm. Like Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Khalid al-Barqi. However, if your teachers are reliable, but they themselves, they rely on someone who's not reliable, it's no longer your responsibility, it is his responsibility. So what Ibn Qawlawayh was trying to say, according to this second opinion, is that I relied on reliable transmitters, my teachers. They are reliable. Now, if they relied on someone who's weak, that's not my problem. That's not my responsibility. That's his responsibility. I'm relying on him. Why did he rely on someone weak or not? That's his business. We'd have to ask him. Maybe he deems him as someone reliable. Who knows? I relied on my teacher who's reliable, but he relied on someone who's weak. In my eyes, he's weak. I think he's weak. But maybe my teacher thinks he's credible, thinks he's reliable. So this is what Ibn Qawlawayh is trying to say in his introduction. And if you remember, I said the introduction is very vague. It could be interpreted in different ways. So this is one. The second proof is that, in fact, there are unreliable narrators in the book of Kamil al-Ziyarat. There are over 60 individuals that are unreliable. And some of them are non-Shia. While he says, مَا رَوَاهُ الثُّقَاتِ مِنْ أَصْحَابِنَا. The reliable individuals from our people. Our people means imamis. But in his book he narrates from non-imamis as well. Thus, that means he was talking about his teachers, not all the other individuals. Because his teachers are all imamis. And they're all reliable. So, the second opinion says he's talking about his teachers. He's not talking about the 388 individuals that are in his book that he narrates from. An fulan, an fulan, an... No, not all of those. Only the ones that he narrates directly from. That's two. Three, he says, and I relied on the scholars of hadith and riwayah. He says, the second opinion says that those 388 narrators that he relied on, they were not all of them scholars of hadith. In fact, most of them were not scholars of hadith. Only a minority of them were. This all means that he did not authenticate all of his narrators, but rather he authenticated only his teachers. This is the second opinion. The third opinion and the final opinion is by Sayyid Sistani. Sayyid Sistani also had a couple of opinions, but the final opinion that he developed and he didn't change, he didn't change his mind, was the following. And this, by the way, this is something very, very normal for Sayyid al-Khoi to switch his opinion, for Sayyid Sistani to switch his opinion. This is very normal. It's just like a doctor who believed in something, and then due to research, due to recent developments, due to either his research or the research of others, he changes his mind. At the end of the day, we're all humans. Even our scholars, they're humans. They're not infallible where they know the truth directly from a divine source. No, they're jurists, mujtahideen. So after a while, they can change their opinion. Sayyid Sistani says that Ibn Qawlawayh neither authenticated all of the narrators, the 388, nor his teachers. Rather, Ibn Qawlawayh is trying to say something else. What? It's the following. He's saying that I relied on the scholars of hadith, those that are the experts in hadith and riwayah, and they are the ones that are reliable. I relied on them. The ahadith that I mentioned in my book, it's because I relied on those scholars of hadith and Rijal. If they narrated a hadith that with a authentic chain of narrators, so be it. If the hadith has someone who's weak, at the end of the day, I relied on that scholar. It's his job and it's his responsibility. It is no longer my responsibility. Let me explain a little bit more. There were scholars of hadith called Nuqad al-Hadith. These scholars, they would look into the books of hadith. They would study the chain of narrators and they would study the content of the hadith. They became the experts. They weren't just merely narrators that would narrate a hadith. They were the experts of hadith. They had many sources. They would study the chain of narrators. They knew who's reliable, who's not reliable. And just because a person is unreliable, it doesn't mean he's lying. It means that sometimes he's lied, sometimes he lies, sometimes he tells the truth. But it doesn't mean that he always lies. But this scholar, although the chain of narrators might have someone unreliable, but he knows the Imam said it. It's been said by the Imam. These scholars include, for example, Sa'd ibn Abdullah. They include Al-Hussein ibn Sa'id. They include Muhammad ibn al-Hasan ibn al-Walid. These three, and maybe others, Ali ibn al-Hussein al-Sa'dabadi, there were 3, 4, 5 individuals. They were the scholars of hadith, Nuqad al-Hadith. Nuqad al-Hadith means they were critical scholars of hadith, critical scholars of hadith. They would study the hadith critically, and they would distinguish between an authentic hadith and an inauthentic hadith. And that hadith could have reliable transmitters or it could have non-reliable transmitters. what Ibn Qawlawayh is saying. And by the way, Ibn Qawlawayh was a student of Sa'd ibn Abdullah. Sa'd ibn Abdullah was one of those nuqad al-hadith, one of those reliable, critical scholars of hadith. He says, I refer to these guys. I refer to nuqad al-hadith, to the critical scholars of hadith. If they accept the hadith, I will accept it. You'll find it in my book, Kamil Ziyarat. If they reject the hadith, I will reject the hadith as well. This is what he's saying. He's not saying that everyone in my book is reliable. He's not saying that everyone in my book is a scholar of hadith. And he's not saying that you will not find someone unreliable in my book. No. He's saying I relied on people that are trustworthy, people that are reliable. I relied on the scholars of hadith. And you might find weak narrators. But those weak narrators, I narrated from them if the scholars of hadith also narrated from them. If the narrators of hadith, if the scholars of hadith, they mentioned these hadith who might have a weak chain of narrators in their books, I'll rely on them. Because these are critical scholars. They know what they're doing. They've done their homework. This is a summary of what As-Sayyid Sistani believed in. So he says he wasn't authenticating the 388, nor is he authenticating his teachers. He was simply stating that I rely on the scholars of hadith. Now, is there such a thing? Sayyid Sistani says yes. In fact, this was a trend among scholars that they would refer to the experts. If the experts, they narrated certain hadith, even if they had weak chain of narrators, they'll rely on them too. For example, As-Sayyid ibn Tawus in his book Falah al-Sa'il, in his introduction, he says, وَرُبَّمَا يَكُونُ عُذْرِي فيما أرويه عن بعض من يطعن عليه أنني أجد من اعتمد عليه من ثقات أصحابنا الذين أسندت إليهم. He says, in my book you might find some weak narrators, but my excuse is that I found the big scholars, the reliable scholars, they narrate this hadith, so I narrate it as well. I'm following their footsteps. I'm relying on him. I don't care if this hadith has a weak chain of narrators or not. I'm relying on that big scholar. Another example is As-Saduq in his book Al-Muqni'. He says, I took away the isnad of these, because Al-Muqni' is basically a book of hadith but without chain of narrators. He says, فَحَذِفْتُ الْأَسَانِيدَ مِنْهُ لَأَلَّا يَثْقُلَ حَمْلَهُ. Because I found the book it would become too lengthy, so I took away the asanid, because for me, I don't need the asanid. إذ ما كان أبينه فيه في الكتب الأصولية موجودا مبينا على المشايخ العلماء الفقهاء الثقات رحمهم الله تعالى. He says, I don't need to mention these chain of narrators because I found these hadith in the books of the scholars of hadith, those reliable scholars of hadith. So I relied on them. I relied on those scholars of hadith, and they mentioned these narrations, so I'll mention those narrations as well. And most likely he's talking about Muhammad ibn al-Hasan ibn al-Walid al-Qummi, because As-Saduq was a student of Ibn al-Walid. And so on and so forth. And so, Sayyid Sistani was the first to develop this opinion, and there are others that followed in his footsteps, like his son Sayyid Muhammad Rida and Sheikh Asif Muhsini, and in our humble opinion, we see that this third opinion is the correct opinion. It is the most accurate opinion. Because why? Because this is a trend. This was a trend among scholars of hadith, that they relied on their elders and their teachers, the experts of hadith. So they might not, they would narrate narrations with authentic chain of narrators, but sometimes they would bring narrations with weak chain of narrators. Why? On reliance of those big scholars of hadith. Because they're the experts. if scholars like Ibn al-Walid or Sa'd ibn Abdullah or Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Isa or others, they brought those hadith in their books, that means you can too. Right? And we also saw that Ibn Qawlawayh, he brings weak narrators in his book. So definitely he's not authenticating all of his narrators. When he says, I narrated from the scholars of hadith, not all of these narrators were scholars of hadith. And as I said, no one before Al-Hurr Al-Amili said that the narrators of Kamil Ziyarat are all authentic. No one said there's a mass authentication in the introduction of Ibn Qawlawayh before Al-Hurr Al-Amili. Due to these reasons, we deem that there is no mass authentication in Ibn Qawlawayh's Kamil Ziyarat. And we end here. In the next episode, we will discuss Ali ibn Ibrahim al-Qummi and his tafsir al-Qummi, and the mass authentication in his book. We will leave that for another episode. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi al-tayyibin al-tahirin.